He's ready for us.
Right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the August 21st, 2023 meeting of the Akron Public Schools Finance and Capital Management Committee. Thank you all for joining us for this, and we're going to jump right into the agenda. Thank you for your patience, anyone who is listening in. Little technical difficulty. It's just part of today's world. It happens sometimes. Item 1.01, previous meeting summary. Are there any questions, comments, corrections to the finance summary from our last meeting, which was actually May? It's been some time. If there is no corrections, comments, we will accept those as given to us. Thank you. And we'll jump right on into item 2.01, understanding school finance. Dr. Thompson.
Well, thank you. So what I thought to do, I was given a list of lots of things to cover for our committee, and we can certainly, which I put them all down, Ms. Autry, for to keep rolling into them as we progress. But I know we're here for an hour, and today a little bit less than. And as dynamic as I am, I'm certain you guys don't want me to rattle on for an hour straight about school finance. So on this PowerPoint, it'll just roll from 2 to 3 to 4 to 5, which is in sync with our agenda. And of course, at any point, if you have questions, please ask. But I think what is most difficult that for people to really understand is how are schools funded and why do schools operate the way that they do. And my experience has been over the years that not only our own staff, but oftentimes even our own administration doesn't really even understand outside of the treasurer's department or maybe the superintendent's office how it works and why it works the way that it does. And to the point, I think I'll ask you a question at the end. It's the age-old question: when schools are back on the ballot, oftentimes people will hear things like this or say things like this. Why don't you balance your budget? I do in my house. Why are you continually over some period of time on the ballot? Why can't you make do with the funds that you have? And the assumption is, of course, or the implication is that we're just wasting money. So one answer is collectively, school boards and school administrators are a collective group of morons. No comment from the peanut gallery. Or perhaps there's a different explanation as to why that occurs. And I would submit to you that there absolutely is. Then a legislative update on House Bill 33, which you've had some, but I just would like to go into a little more detail. And it's a lot to digest, and I think that's important. Then looking at how that House Bill 33 segues into the 5-year forecast, of course, and understanding the changes to our 5-year forecast, and what do we do with the dollars that we have that are on hand, which right now is about $100 million. That's in unencumbered expenditures right now, and some of them become more encumbered, of course, as the year goes on. But what do we do with those dollars in the interim? We'll talk a little bit about that. And then how do we make sure we're in line with our 5-year forecast from month to month to month? Do we know? And how we do that is through reconciliation, which we'll catch the board up at the next board meeting on 2 months worth, and then from that point forward, you'll get one of those documents each month, letting you know where we stand. And our tech people, we lost our screen. If you guys could take a look at that. And then we recently had a day retreat with just the finance department, where we came up with an overall goal for our finance department, which is in line with the goals of the district's retreat, which was the week prior to our treasurer's report, or our finance department's retreat. And then additionally, our finance department is working on some of their own goals internally that we're going to use, obviously to drive performance, but also for a level of accountability on how we'll do our evaluations inside of the Treasurer's Department. So with that being said, I can keep going, but would you mind calling Elise and just let her know that that we could get a tech person? Can you do that for me? Thank you, Todd. So this next slide, if you could see it, it would say, why do school districts need additional levies? Akron's fortunate. We're at 12 years right now, moving to 13 years without being on the ballot. On average in Ohio, school districts are on the ballot every 4.5 years for additional dollars. Now, part of the reason that Akron, the urbans have in terms of financial advantage, perhaps over some of the suburban districts, even though urban districts generally spend less per pupil than some of our suburban counterparts. But the difference is we do receive more state dollars per student than many of wealthier suburban districts do. And as a result of that, we can see increases from funding, but we're very reliant on what the state decides. So the state drives that. We know from House Bill 33 that we'll talk about in a little bit, we know what the impact is at least for the next 2 years. We know what the projection is for the next 4 years, and I'll share that. But aside from state funding, where does our money come from? It comes from local property tax, whether that's business or residential property tax, and that's what drives our budget. That has not been increased for nearly 13 years. So what I really wish you could see now, which we're getting handicapped at this point, can you see it on your screens?
Yeah, we have it.
Okay, so if you could be looking at the one that's got a bunch of numbers on it, 104 million across the top, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27. Yeah, back up a little bit.
The simplified financial statement?
Wait, okay, yeah, it should be a May 23rd forecast is filed with the state budget. So what you're looking at there is this is jumping things around.
So after that slide, we have, what is this?
Gas station? Okay, all right, thank you. Mine's jumping around, thank you. So what's driving school finance? If those of you that remember 1976, if you could, so you should be looking at a gas station. What drove, if you remember in 1976, what was happening in 1976? You remember that?
2 years before I was born, Steve.
Yeah, I know. You're just a kid. You're a kid.
I was, yeah.
All right, so there's only one or two of us in this room that can have this discussion. So let me educate you on what was happening in 1976.
I know that.
As I was a
Afros,
paper
yeah.
boy in 1976. But what was happening, and this picture is not from them, but it illustrates what was happening. Do you remember the name OPEC? Mm-hmm. Yes. And that was the conglomeration of Middle Eastern countries that that still remain to be the major oil suppliers in the world. And they banded together and decided that if they were to reduce production of oil, it would drive up the cost of oil per barrel and thus generate more revenue for what they were selling. That was happening along with right now we're at an interest rate that's, I think, or an inflationary rate that's just dropping below 7%, right around in there, which is incredibly high for most of our experience over the last probably 15 years or so, 20 years perhaps. But in 1976, the inflationary rate was over 20%. So the economy was terrible. Gas prices were really high. There was gas shortages. Cars would line up to get gas in 1976. The economy was in shambles, but what was happening to public schools? Good or bad? You would assume bad, but it was just the opposite. So prior to House Bill 920, as your house went up in value, which happens under inflationary circumstances, so on paper, people's homes were rising. So as people's homes rose, the county auditor simply adjusted your tax to schools with the value of your home.
Yeah.
So schools were flush with cash, but people couldn't actually sell their home for that cost. It was just essentially fictitious on paper. Created this horrible economic situation, but schools were good. Schools were good. So he becomes governor, Governor Voinovich. At the time, you know, he was a Cleveland mayor, and then he was a state senator. He was a state senator at that time in 1976, and he championed House Bill 920. And what House Bill 920 says is that whenever a levy passes, whatever dollar amount it's drawing or collecting, it stays frozen at that dollar amount in perpetuity. So what happens is it created this phenomenon we now experience. You have voted mills. So when we vote for a levy, they put it in millage. So you have the voted mills, and now we have, because of House Bill 920, effective mills. So what happens, one mill starts collecting more and more and more over the course of time, which would raise taxes. So House Bill 920 says no. Schools, when you pass a levy, you're frozen at that dollar amount until the next levy. No way to increase it, so it stays flat. So the county auditors constantly, so you passed a 9 mil levy, well, maybe 10 years from now, it only needs to collect 7.2 mils to get the same dollar amount. So effective mills starts dropping below what was actually passed. So millage rates decline, dollar amount stays frozen. So let's say a corporation were to move, a brand new Amazon builds their headquarters in Akron. Are they going to pay taxes? Unless we abate them, that's a different discussion entirely. But assuming they weren't, they would pay taxes. Would we get more money? No, because what it would do is the county auditor would just adjust collection rates down so that we would collect the same amount of money in perpetuity. So it'd be like you're a nurse, and whatever dollar amount you make right now per hour, or salary you make now, works now. But what if you didn't get a pay raise next year? Maybe okay. What about 5 years from now, you're still making the same amount? 10 years, you're still making the same amount. Would you be able to pay your bills? No. And that's what's happened to schools. Because of House Bill 920, which is now codified in the state constitution, whenever a levy passes, it stays frozen at that collection rate forever. So it's constantly driving schools to be back on the ballot with some regularity, because the only increase that they're going to see is whatever the state offers, and that's it. And sometimes that's okay, and sometimes that's efficient enough, but many times it's not. So we're at the mercy, if you will, of the state and our local taxpayers. Trying again. So the next slide that you'll see on your computer is, it looks like the first what would pop up if we were looking on the screen, because it pops up individually, but it would show the expenses. And you can see that it's flat. So, our revenue, it's flat. And then I don't care how good of stewards we are with our money, no matter how conservative we are with our money, our expenditures are going to increase. You can't hold people at 0% pay raises forever, for one. But even if you could, we can't control the increase in healthcare costs. 20% of our budget is comprised of things like fuel, electricity, bus purchases, et cetera, special education costs, on and on and on and on. All things that are expenditures that we simply cannot control. So eventually the axis of expenses will exceed revenue. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean we're immediately back on the ballot as we go into deficit spending. That's another unique component or just way of doing business in schools that would differ from business, for example. We know that we're going to go into deficit spending. It's going to happen. We want to try to reduce the degree to which those separate, to try and keep them as close as long as possible to stay off the ballot. But the fact that next year, if you were to take a look at our 5-year forecast, what you would see is that we go into deficit spending next year. And then we're in deficit spending all the way through the rest of our 5-year forecast. It's almost impossible to completely stop in public schools. So if you go to the next slide down, it's not letting me. Oh,
Steve, can I ask a
I got
question?
you. Yes, sir.
So before we go to the next slide, so if I understand just in theory, in general, what you're trying to say about, it almost seems like there's a pot of money that schools have. So let's make up a number. If schools are going to get $20 million this year from taxpayers and property taxes.
Right.
What you're saying earlier, if Amazon moved in and took a certain portion of that $20 million, they would pay part of that $20 million, right?
That's right.
But if they left, in theory, the amount would stay the same. We would have to pay more as taxpayers, homeowners in Summit County.
That is the flip side, the unintended consequence. That's interesting that you caught that. That is the unintended consequence of House Bill 920. That's exactly right.
Wow.
So if people left and abandoned homes, apartment complex closed, a business closed its doors, et cetera, the county auditor is still required to collect this, as a result of House Bill 920, to collect the same dollar amount and keep schools funding flat. Now, state funding can fluctuate up and down based on student enrollment and other mitigating factors. But as far as property tax goes, we're guaranteed to collect that same dollar amount. So it does, 920 does have a reverse effect. Doesn't happen very often, but it does have a reverse effect, for sure. Are we going to be able to project? No, okay. The next slide that you're looking at is just an interesting slide. I wish people at home could see it. Not shocking, really, but that shows the federal government's deficit spending. And, we're talking significant numbers. But, this notion that somehow we're mismanaging our funds if we're in deficit spending, it's just simply the way in public education is structured and set up to occur. And the next slide kind of illustrates it a little bit, often referred to as boom and bust cycles. So let's say that we're going to be on the ballot in 2 years or 3 years or whenever we project to be on the ballot. We'll talk a little bit in a minute about how that might be a little further off, which is a positive than we initially thought because of House Bill 33. But if we were to be on the ballot, which might be disconcerting to some people, wait a minute, why are you asking for so many mills? You don't need that much money to balance your budget. So you're asking for a $35 million increase in annual funding, but yet you don't have the deficit to support that right now. But why would we do that? In order to build cash reserves, because we know as soon as we pass that levy, we're going to go flat on expenses again. Expenditures will still continue to rise, and that's what helps keep us off the ballot for a prolonged period of time. So I think that's one of the tough decisions that school boards have to make when setting millage, is how much is going to extend the levy so you're not back on the ballot 2 or 3 or 4 years later, but at the same time not putting so much pressure on taxpayers that we create a situation that's either A, untenable for them to support, or B, puts undue burden on them for a longer period of time than is necessary. So it's finding that sweet spot, and how we will do that is we'll model different amounts of a levy and those collections to determine how long that actually keeps us off the ballot and what feels like a reasonable amount of time. A little bit difficult to do compared to so many things happening from the state level that it makes it a bit more challenging, but we'll still model that before we would recommend any specific amount. But what is most just absolutely a definite is we are levy eminent. It will occur. It's just a matter of when and how long we can slow the rise in that trajectory of our expenditures.
Yeah, I think just a couple comments here, if I may. I think there's a logical intersection point in this conversation between, well, this topic and a review and a revision of our cash reserve policy. Mm-hmm. Because I think our payroll is, what, $12 million every 2 weeks, ballpark?
Ballpark.
Yeah, and so having said that, the intersection point, though, here is cash reserve policy, because you would not expect a healthy company. It's a cash reserve, I'm talking about days cash on hand, right? So how long could you pay your bills if you had no additional revenue coming in, right? And so, for example, when you look around, take SUMA. I used to work at SUMA, and we were somewhere around 200 and, anywhere from 230 to 280 days cash on hand, which basically implies that if we stopped getting any money today, we could pay everything out for another 280 days. Our current cash reserve policy, I want to say, is I don't have it up, but we should review it. But I want to say it's something like it would amount to essentially 4 pay periods. Which is ridiculous, right? So that's something that I think we need to be able to. So as we're having the community and levy conversation, there has to be a way for us to communicate in layman's terms the intersection of this that you're walking us through with why it's important to have a cash reserve policy, because levies don't always pass on the first time as well, right? So if you fail
historically,
a levy,
they have not.
That's right. Yeah. So if you fail a levy, so if you fail once or twice in trying to pass a levy, if your cash reserve policy puts you at $48 million and you fail levy, now you really are in trouble, because now you really are now you can't pay your bills, and now that's when you got to start getting into catastrophic layoffs and programmatic cuts and things like that. And so part of, I think this conversation is us wanting to have a cash reserve policy that is consistent with how we and the timing with which we pursue levies, and being able to explain that. And I don't know how to explain that in layman's terms, but it's something that we should figure out how to do in a way that's effective, because the public is going to, again, to your point, Dr. Thompson, that's something the public is going to have to understand, especially as we're asking folks who are already strapped, and we know, listen, in Akron, approximately 60% of people in Akron, is that last time I checked again, are renters, and so you're passing levies, but those increases in property tax, 2/3 of your property tax, if you look at your statement, 2/3 of your property tax already goes to APS. So if you're increasing, if you're passing levy increasing property taxes, that's got to get passed along to somebody. Who's it get passed along to? It gets passed along to, often gets passed along to folks who are renting, so which is essentially over half of the city is renting. So
Did you say 60? Is that high?
It's close to 60%.
Really?
So,
Okay.
Fact check me on it, but I know it's at least 50%. I think it's as high as 60 in Akron. But and you contrast that with a national home ownership rate of somewhere around 59%. Mm-hmm. So I know Akron lags that number. But again, when you're passing school levies, and a lot of our families, again, we're a free lunch district, right? So a lot of our families are going to be impacted because they could see their rents increasing. Because we passed a school levy. So these are all things that, and not to sidetrack you, but these are all kind of things that we have to be able to figure out. How do we communicate in a, in a streamlined way through multiple communication channels to make sure that people understand, and we may need to work with internally and maybe even work with a company that specializes in messaging to figure out how do we message this in a way that it makes sense for the layperson.
Yeah.
Because this is all fine for us, but we've been having these kinds of conversations with you and then with your predecessor for years, right? So, but we didn't get it the first time we sat through this. I remember sitting here with Miss Autry 4 years ago, listened to some of his. I'm like, I don't know what he's talking about, So, and we sat down and did extra tutoring sessions so that way we could make sure we understood everything, all the moving pieces and parts, right? So again, thinking about anybody who's watching this is probably lost right now, and that's not your fault. It's just it's not an easy topic. I think the graphics are making it easier for folks to sort of visualize. But again, we know there's probably 10 people watching this right now.
Yeah,
if we're lucky. So we think about the levy cycle and that communication and marketing plan. How do we communicate these concepts in a way that's simplistic? So I'll stop there.
And it's ironic that you mentioned a cash reserve policy because we have a recommendation in here.
Oh,
that's our
60
goal.
million.
That is our goal in the finance department. But this graph just illustrates those boom and bust cycles, assuming you're on a 4-year levy cycle, which is pretty much on par with what most of the state is. And it looks just like this set of stairs. You generate more revenue than you need. The axis crosses. You go into deficit spending. You hold off for a few years, and then you're back on the ballot again and again and again and again. And it is the unintended consequence of solving for a problem in 1976. That was a serious problem. I would submit to you there were some other options they could have included in there, like caps on growth and some other things that would have mitigated this and made it more tolerable. But that's the environment that it's created. And you're absolutely right. The biggest challenge of school finance, really school in general, how do you effectively communicate? And that is an age-old challenge. But what you're looking at right here is the May 23 5-year forecast. And what I really want to bring your attention to, that matters, that there's really 2 lines that matter to us. Let's go about halfway down where it says revenue, surplus, or deficit. And you can see that in 2024, now we did adjust this, which is the fiscal year that we're in right now. But adjusting for a $6.5 million deficit spend is very different than move to 2025, adjusting for a $35 million deficit spend. And as you can see, the number just grows and grows and grows. And that's what forces us to be on the ballot. And then across the very bottom, which again is your quick little reference for what matters most, what's our ending cash balance? And you can see that we start to drop off pretty quickly. In 2026, to put this in perspective, we're spending a little over $30 million a month in totality. So in 2026, we're projecting to end the year with about 2 weeks worth of operating capital. So to speak to what you were just referencing, Dr. Hall, that's probably not somewhere we want to be. All that would be is one levy failure away from some level of state receivership. And then we go into a $40 million deficit.
Dr. Thompson, why are the ending cash balance with and without levies the same? Am I misunderstanding something there?
So what it's saying is that the revenue or surplus or deficit without any levies. So Todd, can you speak to any new levies? Any new levies, yeah. So it's speaking to new levies.
Okay.
And so, or sometimes some school district will have renewal levies that renew every certain number of years, but they have to be voter approved. That the state will not allow you to count that in your 5-year, or you have to demonstrate what it would be with it and without it. So under the newly adopted Ohio budget bill, which is 2024, 2025, so we know we have those 2 fiscal years that it absolutely includes. It is not a budget bill anymore. It is adopted by the governor. It's in law. It's codified. And some major changes that we've seen is the big differences were in the funding formula, which determines how much money we receive per student. They went from 2018 inputs and moved it to 2022 inputs. To put that in perspective, for across the state, that's a budgetary increase per school of about 11%.
So wait, I'm sorry. So 2018 inputs, you mean as far as enrollment?
Not enrollment, just costs. The factors were based on
Unit price costing.
yes, from what, 5 years ago?
Roger that. Okay.
Okay. And then Ed Choice, which is a negative impact, a little bit hard still for us to determine what that means is, or how that'll actually affect us. So any student that is at 450% above the federal poverty line, which, to put that in perspective, is $125,000 with four-person family, would take you to the 450%. That is not, when Ed Choice came out and some of these programs came out, they were specifically geared to primarily students in poverty. But they're not students in poverty. They've gone well beyond that. And above that, you could be at $175,000 for those four-person family and still qualify, scaling down, but still qualify for dollars. So theoretically, students who have never attended APS can withdraw money from essentially from APS and apply that to their tuition at said private school.
Yeah, and what's wild about this is you really allow private schools to get fat, because if you're a private school, you just raise the cost of your tuition to equal that of the federal, of that 450% number, and then charge on top of that. So I mean, so that, what's it, about $8,800? I'm sorry, about $8,000 now.
$8,000. It's a little over $8,000 for grades 7 through 12.
Yeah.
Our 7 through 12, and then K6 is about $6,300.
Right.
I think I have the exact numbers. Will be coming up.
Right. So there's a number of private schools in this area. I won't say their names, but they're, for their sort of K through 6, cost for one kid is somewhere around $4,000 a year. So with the voucher being equal to a number that's above that, they just simply raise the cost to $6,000. And then if they want to protect the culture of their building, is what some of them are calling it, they simply tack on additional fees and say, well, our school now costs $9,000 to go here, right? So we're getting the $6,000 we were already getting, plus we're getting $3,000 from people who can afford to pay the $3,000. And we know what that means. It's excluding certain families, certain types of demographics,
Yep.
right? So it's really getting nasty out there, and it's just really, and I'm not saying every school is doing that, but a lot of them are already communicating to parents and families about the adjustments in fee schedule and expanding class size, and it's really just not a good thing. So
I think the biggest thing that concerns me is and I welcome the accountability for us, but let's put the same accountability measures on all schools, not just public schools. So if you're going to take public dollars, then you should also take the accountability that comes with accepting public dollars. But that's not currently the way things are structured.
So because the private schools don't take the OSTs, correct?
Excuse me?
The private schools, they're not part of the state testing scheme, right?
That's correct.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And they can choose to educate who they want to educate, reject who they choose to educate. I don't know if you've ever heard that story about the Ben and Jerry's, where they came to a school. Actually, it's a true story. They came to a school, and they were doing professional development about how they should run their schools and run them like Ben and Jerry's. Great ice cream, produce great ice cream. You should produce great students. And then a teacher raises her hand, and he calls on her, and she said, "You guys make great blueberry ice cream. Love it." said, oh, he's smiling. Yeah, we do. Great blueberry ice cream. He's like, I'll bet you guys only use the finest ingredients. And he says later, as he's reflecting on it, I felt the trap. Mm-hmm. And he said, well, of course, we only take the best blueberries, the best product. And then she says, of course, well, we're not Ben & Jerry's. We don't get to choose our blueberries. Mm-hmm. We take smashed blueberries, small blueberries, good blueberry, Mm-hmm. And the point is, so many times people say run your school district like a business. And while there are some similarities, there are many differences. The way we're funded, what we do, who we accept, all of those things make our situation different. And some of our private school competitors are more like Ben & Jerry's. And so I don't think the comparisons are fair.
Yeah.
So cash options for all sporting events, I just throw that in because, Todd and I recently received something from the state auditors wanting us to talk about, where are concerns about fraud and et cetera, and we have this form. Actually, you have it, I believe, sitting in your email as well, Dr. Hall, and it's a form we have to fill out. And, back when I was an athletic director, cash flow, we did everything with petty cash and collect student accounts, and all of those things were all cash. The parents paid their school fees in cash, and there was just cash everywhere. Well, that's where fraud occurs. Mm-hmm. And so we got away from that. But now a component of House Bill 33 brings us back to that, which feels like we're reversing the clock a bit, and that we're now telling our athletics and our athletic directors that we're now having to move out petty cash again, et cetera, because someone can still pay online like we have been doing, but if someone comes to the gate and says they do not have an electronic ticket, we have to sell cash tickets. And so it just feels like while I think I understand the problem they were trying to resolve or solve, they created a whole litany of other challenges that we had gotten away from that we're moving back to. And on the next slide, I think it's really important. It just shows you the net increase and decrease in revenue from the forecast from May 2023. And we will update this, and we're going to have to update it sooner than, I'll bring it before you probably twice. So you'll see a 5-year forecast fairly soon in the first board meeting in September, and we'll ask for your approval of that updated 5-year forecast. The reason for it, even though it's not due until November, is because when we have a ratings meeting that we must attend as it corresponds with our certificates of participation, our COPS loan. So we have to get a credit rating, and in order to do that, we're going to S&P and we're presenting, and we have to do that in September. And in order to present, they want an updated 5-year forecast. And I don't want to show them the May 2023 submitted 5-year forecast because that's not really reflective now of where we stand fiscally, and it would hurt our credit rating. So it would behoove us to move a little quicker. Then what we will do is we continue to dive into the 5-year forecast and spend more time on it. If it changes, we'll bring it back to the board before we submit in November to ODE. So cumulatively over the next 4 years, we're receiving $70 million. So to be clear, that's not $70 million a month, but that's what we're projecting, $70 million over the course of the next 4 years. So again, bottom line here, it just shows the increase in funding, and we saw the decrease in funding in fiscal year 23, which we had talked about. We're at the mercy of the state, and sometimes it works for us, and sometimes it works against us. In fiscal year 23, it worked against us. But you can see how the numbers climb. Those are cumulative dollar amounts over the next 4 years. 2 of those are locked in. 24 and 25 are locked in numbers. 25 and 26 and 27 are projected numbers. So obviously, you're going to see a healthier 5-year forecast There are some things I'm going to show you that are negatively impacting our 5-year forecast that we're working through as an update. But before we get there, the DPIA, Disadvantaged Pupil Impact Aid, requires that we spend
Steve,
some of those.
I'm sorry, can you go back to
Yes.
the May 2020? So here, so can you just walk us through some of the lines? So I followed that 26 and 27 are projections, but 24 and 25, that top line. So I guess I'm looking at here, we went from, I'm thinking back to so the 2024 on the original 5-year forecast was, just want to make sure I have this right. Let's see, 2024 was, let's see, I was have them side by side. So on the bottom there, the cumulative, that zero, that negative 273, that 9.2 million, is that $9.2 million? Is that our, let's see, that is our ending, no, I'm sorry, that's the yearly revenue surplus or deficit.
Okay, so good question. What that is showing, that 9.2 million represents additional dollars to budget in our 5-year forecast that you saw from May of 2023. So that's additional state dollars.
Right.
Then the next year we get about 11 million more for a total of 20 million additional state dollars. That's baked in that's baked in the budget bill right now.
So okay, so that's incremental.
That's
so I'm
correct.
getting 9.5 million in 2024, and then I get 11.5 million on top of the 9.5 in 2025.
That's correct.
All right. Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
yes,
That was my clarifying. And then, for example, when I'm looking at 2020, so is that 9.245 million number that you're showing at the bottom there?
Yeah.
That number represents what?
That number represents how much additional dollars we're receiving on our 5-year forecast, less the $273,000.
Gotcha. Okay. And then if you go back to the May 5-year forecast slide, sorry, I just want to make sure I'm reading this right. So it was negative 6.5 million for 2024.
Becomes about a $3 million surplus if we do nothing.
Because we're getting the extra 9.2 or $3 million.
That's
up.
correct.
Okay. All right. Gotcha. So that $9.2 million number here is, you're just showing, okay, that's it. Okay. I've got you. I'm following you here.
That's
okay.
just
So then
additional dollars that are not, reduced for any reason.
Yep.
And it's on top of our state funding we're already receiving.
okay. I'm good. All right.
So that's why, this budget bill, again, I don't know what the impact of the 450% of the poverty line, the Ed Choice will do, and we have some increasing busing issues as well. But it is a generally overall very positive thing for Akron Public Schools.
So let me ask you one more question. Sorry, I lied. I do have one more question. Okay, never mind. So you don't have the additional state funding, which is a point of your following slide. You don't have the additional state funding baked into the 5-year forecast.
No,
You're adding that in.
not currently.
Okay, so 2025 is we're still going to be running a revenue deficit in 2025, even with the additional state funding of about 17
I believe
million.
what you're going to see, and I don't want to, the age-old adage of under promise and over deliver,
Right. Yeah.
the hallmark of any treasurer. But I believe what we will see are no negative numbers on our we'll see deficit spending towards the back end of that 5-year forecast, but we will not see negative overall cash balances through the entire 5-year forecast.
Right. So we wouldn't see a negative ending cash balance. I'm with you on that.
Yeah.
But we're still deficit spending.
We will
in
still
2025.
we'll still
Right.
end up deficit spending,
Yep.
and of course that's constituted on the district making no changes to staffing levels.
Roger
And I would submit to you, and I believe that this is something that Dr. Robinson will reiterate as well. I think it's incumbent upon us as our student population decreases that we have to right-size our district in accordance with. That doesn't mean take anything away from our kids or not have programming. It just means make your staffing equivalent to what your student population represents and what they need. So, you know, we institute a few of those cost-saving measures coupled with our 5-year forecast, our additional funding from House Bill 33. I think we can put ourselves in a position that is a fairly favorable looking 5-year forecast moving forward. And while again, we certainly will be levy imminent, I believe we've got to be pushing a record for the run of time between tax increases asked by the school district. There have been tax increases for people in Akron, but not being driven by the school.
No, I think it is a record. I mean, if you go back to the late 70s, we've never gone this long without asking for money.
Since 1976,
Right.
this is going
This is
to
the
probably
longest
be a
time.
record.
Yeah, this is the longest time. But the reason why I make that point about the fact that we're still deficit spending.
That is correct.
Even with the increases in state funding, because there are some who are going to say, well, you're getting extra dollars from the state. Why do you need to pass a levy? Well, hold up a minute. You know, the state increases are not covering the increase in expenses.
That's correct.
We're still deficit spending.
They're helping us push it out,
Correct.
and they're reducing the amount that we deficit spend,
Yeah.
but it doesn't completely wipe it out.
That's right. And to the point you were making, you know, with Dr. Robinson, you know, is the other intersecting component of this conversation is we've got 12 buildings that are below 60% capacity.
Yeah,
Right.
at least.
Right. And so the right sizing of it is going to involve some really difficult decisions over the next 4 years about, because some schools more likely than not are going to have larger footprints while others go away. And what we do with those brand new, almost brand new buildings, right, or newer buildings, what we do with an empty newer building, you know, I think that part of it can be exciting because you're thinking about like how do we partner with the communities in the city to use those buildings for alternative purposes, you know, so these CLCs Ms. Autry, we may have whole buildings that just become community centers.
Yep.
You know, so, but anyway, so again, just things to think about. I don't want to sidetrack you, I already have twice.
And I also think that another way of looking at our declining student enrollment is it also creates opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
So what I mean by that is, while yes, we have 35 newer buildings, but it is also an opportunity to take a building that is attractive and functional and create programming that would bring students back to our school district or attract students from other school districts. So I think there's a paradigm shift that also needs to occur that not only makes the district more vibrant, the city more vibrant, but from a treasurer's perspective, more economically stable as well. So, you know, driving student numbers and continuing to make decisions that keep kids in our district is critical. But I think it's also important for the community to also understand it isn't just Akron that's losing students. It's all of Northeast Ohio.
Yeah.
So this is a phenomenon that we're seeing in everywhere. The population of Akron 25 years ago was 300,000 people, and now it's 190,000 people. So the population that we serve is declining. The majority of our school-age students in the city of Akron, the majority of them still attend Akron Public Schools, but we can do better. So again, the disadvantaged pupils is important, and the transportation piece, we're not quite sure what that's going to impact us to look at. But again, the flip of this, or the different way of looking at this, is I think it's probably time for us moving this year to take a hard look at who we transport and who we don't transport, because we could be cutting our nose off to spite our face, meaning not offering transportation to certain students based on where they live from a straight up put it on a map and how far is it to the school, which is what Ohio Revised Code says, versus taking into other considerations like lack of sidewalks, et cetera, safe routes to school. And then as it turns around, some of these students end up in private schools because of that reason and end up getting transportation when we might have been far better served, both economically and test scores and every other way, to provide that transportation and increase that expenditure a little bit, but to generate more revenue than we're expending.
I couldn't agree with you more. Yeah.
So I also, moving on to some of our investment performance, probably one thing people don't know that the school does, and I know we're running out of time here, but I just wanted you to understand, and you can read through this, that we put our dollar, we invest through a company called Red Tree. So we just don't let the money sit in the bank. We do put some money in a bank, like Star Bank, for example, and I believe we're at what, Todd, 5.5% interest, 5.25% interest, I believe, through Star Bank. I know it's just slightly over 5%. So money that we want to turn around quickly, we'll put in a bank, and some money that we don't need to turn around as quickly, instead of it just all sitting in a bank, you can see the different areas and where we invest them and some of the dollars that we've netted as a result of our investments. So we're generating revenue by investing, and I don't think most people understand that and know that, like a business, we're trying to generate revenue any way that we can. So they're in basically three funds: general fund, construction fund, permanent improvement fund, and the benefits fund is where those dollars are, and it gives you a little snapshot of how much money the district has earned in interest through our investments through Red Tree. So Red Tree is doing a really good job for us. In my previous district, we used Red Tree, and they did a really good job for us there as well. They are a reputable company, and the yields are pretty good. So that has benefited us as well. That will also be encapsulated in the 5-year forecast when we update it as well, the fact that we're doing a little bit better on our investments than we have historically. It's just a better market right now. But there are some pressures on the 5-year forecast. So I wanted to bring this to your attention. The blue is staffing levels, and the orange is student population. So while I'm not suggesting that we're not watching our hiring or anything of that nature, I do want to bring it to your attention that the gap is getting wider and wider and wider, and we need to take a look at, and I've heard this board echo this many times, if you make an investment, what's the ROI on the investment? What are we getting as a result of, you start program A, does program A, after a reasonable amount of time, generate improvement in student performance? If it doesn't, then perhaps we need to take a hard look at where we're investing our dollars and what we're spending them on and what's more cost effective. Another problem that we do have, or challenge that we do have, is we have a current year-to-date expenditure that's unfavorable. In other words, the 5-year forecast said X amount of dollars, and the actual collections was $10 million difference. Now, we're running that down right now. I'm not sure that is actually going to be $10 million, and we're trying to figure out what that is. To put that in perspective, if it ends up being off by $10 million, that's about 2.5%. That's not a significant error on a 5-year forecast, but nonetheless, we're dogging that down, and we'll be able to report out exactly what happened and why we have a $10 million variance and what we projected and what is actual. And then for goal setting, Dr. Hall, this is, so when we went on our retreat, which was a very productive with our senior administration, we came up with goals that I'm sure Dr. Robinson will be presenting at some point to the board. But one of the pieces in our department that we extrapolated out of that we're setting as a goal for our department. But before I do that, I would love to show you that video, but we don't have time. It's a really cool video, but I just don't have the time since it's 5:33, so I'll skip it. But our treasurer's goal is that the district shall maintain at least 2 months of unencumbered cash reserves at all time. That means about $60 million. I'd rather it be $90 million. The state of Ohio says that they recommend, not require, recommend 3 months of cash carryover at all times. Well, that would put us in a very difficult spot. That means we couldn't drop below 90 million in cash reserves. So think about that 5-year forecast and what our next 5-year forecast would start looking like. If we were to accept this, if the board were comfortable with this as our benchmark, when we are projecting to go below 2 months of cash carryover, so that number is going to grow always. As our expenditures grow, so does 2 months of unencumbered cash carryover. Right now it's 60 million. Then that would be the trigger for the board and the administration. First, the administration to either reduce costs, streamline our operations, or go on the ballot, or a combination thereof. So you could look at a 5-year forecast and say, we're in deficit spending, but we're still sitting at $80 million in cash reserves. That's okay, we'll keep going. But the next year, we drop to $42 million in cash reserves. That would be a trigger, what we're recommending, that would be a trigger for the board to say, even though, when you look at $42 million, you think, gosh, that's a lot of money. It is a lot of money, but not when you're running a $300 million, and by the time the 5-year forecast is over, $400 million operation. 60 million is not that much, unfortunately. That keeps us above board for about 2 months, and then we're in big trouble. So we couldn't sustain. It buys us basically about a year. So in that year, we would have to be continually on the ballot and pass. On average, Akron has historically failed at least once before passage of a levy, historically.
So the obvious question, I know we're out of time, is I'm really anxious for us to start talking about a May levy, right? May of 2024. I mean, we've been talking, you and I have been talking about this quite a bit, and we're in August already.
Well,
right?
it isn't even May. To get you even a little more amped up, it's actually March.
March, yes.
So you back off the days, it would be, the board would need to take action no later than in that January timeframe. It could take action sooner. But the only thing that I would ask is, let's see the 5-year forecast as we work through our investments, work through that $10 million number, work through the additional House Bill 33 impacts, and then and see. I think what you'll see is that we bought some time, but ultimately that's a board decision. Again, helping the board make a decision, I think, is having at least administrative guidelines that say this is our trigger, so that everybody's aware.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing to point out is that when you look at the data of levies passing, I know there's data on this, that school levies have a better passage rate in presidential election years, right? And so to that point, that's, that's why I'm anxious to see us beyond the ballot in 2024.
In November?
If November is the latest, because again, that's the demographics of who votes favors us in a presidential election more so than it does and so waiting to 2028. I mean, I think in between 2024 2028. I mean, I think it's tough sledding, which is why again I would counsel us to move forward with at least taking one bite at the apple in November 2024. I'd love to see us go on in March. That way we get 2 bites at the apple in a presidential year.
Well, we would certainly have time to, from just requirements in terms of, it takes 2 board votes in order to be on the ballot, so we certainly have time to do that before March. The projected date, although not in stone, is March 19th, 18th, or 19th.
It's 19th.
So that, although that could change, it's still not completely solidified. But that would put us at the latest coming to the board in January, and I would prefer to back it up even a month sooner than that, just in case there's a problem filing paperwork or something that we have given ourselves a little bit of. You can go file as early as you want. You just can't file late.
Well, and the other practical reality here is that we're going to have new board members in January. And so the other reason to do it before January is so that way you're not having to play catch up.
Yeah.
You get other folks up to speed to explain all this before you.
Yeah.
You know, so I mean that's the other reason why too is it allows us to be a bit more efficient in our usage of time as an entity.
Well, again, if you can just bear through one more board meeting in September, we'll have an updated 5-year forecast that'll really put you in, I think, as good a position as you can be in as a school board to make that decision. But certainly, most of the consultants will tell you that presidential years are better, more likely than non-presidential years in terms of the higher the voter turnout, the more likely school levies pass. So just from a strategic perspective, that's 100% accurate. So I'm sorry we've gone over by 10 minutes. Are there any questions? I was going to do a little exercise with you. I was going to have you guys get on and get off a bus, but we'll save that for another day, and we'll save the video. The video was killer. Just killer. It is, actually. But we'll come back to that another day. Any questions?
Thank you, Dr. Thompson. Any questions at all? I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to save them for the next finance meeting. So anything that we didn't get through today, we'll certainly just add it to the future agenda of our next finance committee meeting. And so also, I just want us to remind us of our promise to the North community as well, because them getting a new building was contingent upon a levy. So that's also very important, and I know there's more conversation around that. So thank you so much, Dr. Thompson. I appreciate it. It's really a true benefit having a former superintendent be in this position to kind of help us better understand. So I really appreciate that. And so if there's no other questions, we will adjourn the meeting at this time.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone.
And